Gracias por su presentación. Perdone, no voy a hablar en español porque estoy aprendiendo español. Voy a hablar en inglés. Espero que en un año puedo hablar su lengua. Gracias. So I'm going to speak about the new challenges of maritime geopolitics and their implications for the South Atlantic. The first thing I'd like to stress is the fact that we are now living in a kind of multipolar world, or more exactly I would say that what we live now is the opposition between the unipolar strength around the US and the multipolar strength. And that's the first point, I think, to understand what is going on in the world, to understand the frame of the international stage, the fact that we have this opposition between, on one side, with the US, all the power that try to establish a unipolar world, and on the other side, many different forces that try to establish a multipolar world. It seems to me that's the main opposition now in the world, and maybe we can resume what's happening in the world in this opposition. So I'm going to underline several dynamics of the maritime geopolitics and try every time to illustrate them in the region which interests us. The first thing I'd like to stress is the fact that the globalization is widely based on the freedom of the maritime trade, and that's the first point. The globalization is widely based on the freedom of the maritime trade. I give you a first figure. Today you have 120,000 ships which are doing 90% of the world commercial transit. And the 80 million barrels of oil asked every day in the world, you have 43 million that are traveling by sea. Thus the globalization bases widely on the revolution of the continent. The Atlantic Ocean, and especially the South Atlantic, is less concerned by this flow of the globalization. Today in volume, you have #1 Trans-Pacific trade, #2 you have what's happening at the Suez Canal between Europe and Asia, and #3 finally you have the transatlantic trade. So globalization is widely connected to these maritime flows. In this new world, the South Atlantic area has a status of periphery. And geopolitically speaking, that's important to keep that in mind, that South Atlantic still have a kind of status of periphery in the globalization. As you know it, a number of historians showed that there is a direct link between this peripheral status of South Atlantic area and the historical downgrading of Argentina in terms of power. I remind you that in the 1920s, Argentine foreign trade represented 5% of the world trade, what was considerable. Argentina was then situated at the same economic level as Australia or Canada. So that's the first point. The second point is that after the US sea power, here comes the sea multipolar world. And that's something new also about the maritime geopolitics. Since 1945, there was an evident relationship between US globalization and US sea supremacy. The United States put themselves in capacity to protect the freedom of movement on the oceans and in the main straits, Gibraltar, Bab el-Mandeb, Hormuz, in the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, Hormuz in Persian Gulf, I mean Malacca and other Asian straits. But now, the US sea supremacy is broken by the new submarine capabilities of merging powers like China, Russia and India. In reality, there are more and more countries capable of blocking the freedom of the trade in open sea and in the main straits. And there is not anymore marine, even the American marine, capable of ensuring freedom. So, in my opinion, that's a very important point in the maritime geopolitics. The fact that the submarine does not give the control of the ocean, but it can forbid the access. And the South Atlantic is primarily concerned, not only Asia. The powers which will count, I mean Brazil and Argentina, are the ones which should invest in powerful naval forces, in particular submarine forces. The third point I'd like to underline is that a multipolar world also means sovereignty above the oceans. This is something which is rather surprising, because at the time we are talking about globalization, usually people think that it's the end of sovereignty. But what's happening about the ocean is the contrary of that. I mean, the sovereignty of states on sea widely extended itself since the 18th century. In this time, you know, there was a territorial sea limited at 3 nautical miles, which is the maximal reach of the artillery, which was the maximal reach of the artillery. And then you have very new sea territories, because the state has to tolerate the armless passage in its territorial sea with 12 nautical miles of coast. Then you have the Akin zone between 12 and 24 miles. Then you have the exclusive economic zone between 24 and 200 miles. And you have also the question to define the continental shelf maximum of 350 miles. And beyond 350 miles, it's the open sea actually, which is free. So you have new, very important stakes about sovereignty, maritime sovereignty, based on the Convention of United Nations Right of the Sea. And why are these stakes of sovereignty so important? Within the framework of the multipolar world, the question of the access to vital resources like energy or mineral resources arises more and more. Let's take the case of hydrocarbons. We extract every day in the world 85 million barrels of oil. In 2003, every day will be needed maybe around 100 million barrels of oil per day instead of 85. Outside Russia and outside the Middle East, the proved unlikely reserve of oil lays in the ocean and the seas. The seas offer 20% of the proved reserve of oil and 30% of the proved reserve of gas. So you can see that it's very important to have a good and optimized maritime territory. Why is it so possible to improve the access to these reserves? Thanks to the technological progress in extraction. The seismic studies in 3 dimensions, the directional drillings allow to push away the limits of the exploration and the production. The geology says that seabed could conceal 70 million of square kilometers of sedimentary ponds susceptible to contain some oil, among which 30 million by less than 500 meters of water. You have 3 barrels on 10, that means 30%, which are already offshore pumped. And on what is offshore pumped, you have what comes from deep offshore. The production capable in deep water, more than 600 meters, has more than tripled since 2000. passing from 1 to 5 million barrels a day for a potential of more than 10 million barrels a day in 2050. Let's look now what takes place in South Atlantic. According to BP Statistical Review of 2011, the Latin America, I give you several figures about Latin America. The Latin America represents 17.3% of the world proved reserve of oil, mainly thanks to Venezuela, as you know, 15.3%, and 211 billion barrels, to compare with the 19.1% of Saudi Arabia. You can see that Venezuela is very close to Saudi Arabia in terms of proven reserves. But with 1% of the world proved reserve, Brazil asserted itself recently as a real power of the oil. Argentina is 0.2% with 2.5 billion barrels. What is not unimportant, Ecuador is 0.4% with 6.2 billion barrels. Let's have a look at the speculation on the Malvinas Island. According to an analysis of Bloomberg of January 19, 2012, the British companies which invest in Malvinas Island for the exploration, mainly four wells, these British companies hope that there is offshore 8.3 billion barrels of reserves. Morgan Stanley considered that these discoveries would have an impact equivalent to those of Ghana, for example with Jubilee field discovered in 2007, that propelled Ghana in the top 50 of the oil states, and of Brazil a few years ago. If Argentina obtained the sovereignty only on Malvinas Island, its proved reserve could be multiplied by 4.3, passing by from 2.5 to 10.8 billion barrels. It would mean that Argentina would become the third oil power of Latin America behind Venezuela, close to Brazil, but in front of Ecuador. So the importance of the Malvinas Island is all the stronger as the energy situation of Argentina is deteriorating. From 2003 to 2010, oil production has dropped 18% and gas production 43%, according to a study from Mercosur, dating from last month, February 2012. And Argentina Energy Institute warned that the country faces an unprecedented energy crisis with strong drops in hydrocarbon reserves production and the loss of self-sufficiency. So you see that the considerable stake in energy rank. At the world level, we attained an increase of disputes and conflicts because of sovereignty on island and archipelagos, which are aggravated every time hydrocarbons exist. You have the case of a new conflict between Lebanon and Israel with the huge gas field Leviathan, which was discovered 10 years ago, and it's a very big issue between the two countries, not how to define the sea limitation. In Asia, you have the conflict between Spratly and Paracels, between several states of a region, which is aggravated by the oil stakes as well as several conflicts in Persian Gulf. Fourth point is the fact that maybe there will be to choose between defense of a marine ecosystem or exploitation of strategical resources. That's the case that rises with Antarctica. Antarctica is administered within the framework, as you know, of a treaty on Antarctica, which was adopted in 1959 by 12 states. The foundation of this treaty is the freedom of research, the scientific cooperation, the banishment of military and nuclear activities. You have 7 states, Argentina, Chile, France, United Kingdom, Norway, New Zealand, that have territorial claims on definite sector. You can see the sector like that, each one for one of the 7 states. Definite sectors of the continent, sometimes since the 20s. With the exception of Chile and of Argentina, the other states recognize mutually the territorial claims. Let's add that most of the states, except the states under the regime of the Treaty of Atlántico, do not recognize these 7 territorial claims. But Antarctica has, for all that, no status of common holdings of the humanity. The theory of sectors has no foundation in international law, and most of the states protested themselves not having accepted it. So we can see clearly on the map, you can see the overlapping of the different sectors, which is a very important point. And mainly claimed by the Argentina, United Kingdom and Chile. Antarctica remains a nature reserve in which any activity of exploitation of mineral resources remains forbidden. But it is clear that in the next decade, because we are in a multipolar world, and because a lot of new emerging countries need access to mineral resources, to energy, Antarctica will be more and more an important state for many countries, not only for this country of the region, but maybe for other countries that can have big interest to be in that region. So the last point I'd like to discuss about is who's going to dominate the South Atlantic. And this part is a focus on the geopolitical ambition of Brazil in South Atlantic and its maritime doctrine, because it seems to me very interesting to have a look on what Brazilians are doing about South Atlantic. In September 2010, Brazil reaffirmed its right on its continental shelf in an oil-rich area. That means beyond 200 nautical miles, by falling up to 350 nautical miles. This extension of maritime sovereignty adds nearly 1 million square kilometers to the Brazilian maritime space, which made it 3.5 million. The new maritime doctrine, introduced in 2008, is one of the big priorities of Brazil. It's a state policy which is led jointly by the Command of Marine and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and geopolitists call it the Blue Amazonian policy. This policy is pursuing 3 objectives. First objective of this Brazilian maritime doctrine is to become a major South Atlantic power and to contain the NATO expansion in the South Atlantic. That's very important. NATO, remember, was initially created only by North Atlantic, but its expansion never ended since the end of the Cold War, and NATO now tries to transform itself in a global NATO, that is to say, a world alliance, led by the US, as you know. The second point about this Brazilian maritime doctrine is the fact that Africa has become a major priority for Brazil. In July 2010, Lula chaired an important summit, Brazil-ECOWAS, in Cape Verde, which included Portuguese-speaking, French-speaking country, English-speaking. And Brazil is the second black country of the world, behind Nigeria, with 76 million Afro-Brazilians on 190 millions. Under the Lula government, Brazil opened 15 embassies in Africa And the goal of the Brazilian Marine is to reach the Guinea Gulf and then to unify South Atlantic between the coast of of Latin America, South America, and the African coast. And the third priority for Brazil in this maritime doctrine is to secure the immense wealth offshore oil and gas of its maritime space. This implies the military growth in the domain of the Navy, submarine, aviation. Brazil could then become one of the biggest producer and exporter of crude oil, and 90% of its production would come from the sea. So you can imagine that they want to secure that production, that offshore production. In a conclusion, what I would say is I really think that because we are more and more in a multipolar world, there is a new opportunity for Argentine to exit from its peripheral status in terms of geopolitics. There is a new opportunity to redefine the geopolitical position of Argentine in a more balanced view between the important power like the US, Russia, China. And I really believe that if Argentina tried to define its own maritime doctrine, it can be one of the major players of the future, because you have a huge potential in terms of mineral, oil and gas resources. You have a certain luck in terms of density of population on your territory, which is a huge territory, because think about the fact that in the next decades Asia will be a crazy world with too many people without sufficient resources, and these countries from Asia are going to try to expand themselves in order to get to the resources. So my opinion is that Argentina needs to protect itself from the future appetite from all this power, this merging power, because the fact is we are in a very big competition on the new quest for resources, and you are not, I mean, just quite in the south hemisphere, far from the big powers, and there is something to think about the fact that the world, the new multipolar world, makes you a new center, not only a periphery of the globalization, but a new center. And with your resources on the ground, in the sea, at the same time it's a very big opportunity for you, but it's also a threat if you don't protect your resources in the future. This is just my opinion. I mean, I'm not here to give lessons, and I don't pretend to do that. It's just a debate between you and me, how to redefine the geopolitical status of Argentina in order to make it one of the best players, one of the main player in the region. About the Malvinas Island, I'm used to speak frankly, and I will do it. I really believe that these are your island, and this island will come back in the mainland. It's just a question of time, and the question is, do we have to consider that the renewal of your power begins with the recovery of the Malvinas Island, or do we have to consider that the recovery will be the consequences of the renewal of your power? I believe that it will be the consequences. I think the best strategy is to renew your doctrine in terms of power, to extend your power on South Atlantic, to make you to put your country in a very balanced position between the big powers like the US, Russia, and China especially, and Russia, especially Russia, but also China can help you to counterbalance the US and British alliance, because there is a de facto a US and British alliance, and I really think then as a result the recovery of Malvinas will come. The last thing I'd like to give to the debates is the fact that I'm rather surprised of something, because I'm used to travel a lot and to discuss with a different army in every country. What I see in Russia, what I see in India, what I see in China is all these countries have no complex about how to think the power. No problem to think a new strategy of power, and in all these countries the army has its own place to participate to the debate to redefine the doctrine of power. I perfectly know what happened in the past with the army, the dictatorship and the war of Malvinas, and the trauma that constitutes the failure. But maybe it's useful to stop with that and to make the army, like in Brazil, participating into the debate to renew your strategical doctrine of power, because the fact is that everybody is doing that. I mean, the US, the British, the French, the Russian, everybody tried to define a new doctrine of power in the multipolar world, how to be a player. So, I mean, Argentina is a very, probably in Latin America, the most educated level country, in my opinion. You have everybody you need here. You don't need anybody. You just have the real level of education. But it seems to me, just my perception, that the trauma of history is something difficult to deal with the notion of power. And maybe that's the point we can discuss. I don't know very frankly about that, without giving any lesson, but just discussing about that. Thank you for your listening, and I'm open to your questions.